Mr. Christopher Breedlove, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to jam with you. You have been organizing community for many, many years and been deeply involved in Burning Man and civic engagement, which I'm curious to learn a bit more about what that even means. I know we live in a world that's quite apathetic, and what I've seen you do is really just you're constantly wanting to inspire and enroll people in participating and in creating together. And you've been creating environments where people can actually engage and have a felt sense of community. And you learned a lot about what it looks like to organize resilient, adaptable communities and organizations. And so I'm really happy to have you here and harvest some of your hard-earned and love-earned wisdom.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and just hearing what Andy was saying too, right? I mean, I'm in LA where the fires were just happening, and so obviously this is a big topic. We're all living through a lot of compounding experiences all happening on top of each other.
Yeah, so having been in LA, being in LA, you didn't lose your home, correct? You were evacuated. Are you home now?
I am, thankfully. I live in Topanga Canyon, and the fire did come up this way. The fire got about 5 minutes walk away from my home, but thankfully it's still here. And when the fire started, I ended up staying here in my local community. Because there were so many fires in LA, the fire crews were very dispersed in the city. And so for the first week, I was able to stay here and really help with our citizen activation. And really all of my experiences that I had had through my work with Burners Without Borders and other places kind of prepped me for that. And then, after that first week, the National Guard was actually able to show up and the firemen. And so then I also knew it was my time to kind of step down and leave. And so I was just able to come back about a week ago.
Oh, so you were prepared. You had basically been training unknowingly, perhaps, for throughout all the different experiences you've had to be able to act immediately in the face of a crisis. And it sounds like help coordinate other people. Is that true that you were actually helping coordinate people on the ground?
Yeah, we have a lot of people who are elderly, a lot of people who might not have the physical ability, and also people who just don't want to leave when something happens. And so a lot of our coordination was around supporting the community who is here, who is unable to evacuate as easily, and then also to do things like turn off people's propane tanks and also support people with small missions, especially when certain yards would start on fire and stuff. There's a certain amount that people who have a minimal amount of training can do. And so we were organizing with that in our community to make sure people had the support they needed.
So basically, Burning Man trained you for this moment. Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's both Burning Man and beyond. And, my role with the Burning Man organization is I'm the director of civic activation. And so that means that, I really have the honor to work with our global community of regional events, of Burners Without Borders chapters, and with our global art grants. And, I think that's what's really taught me a lot of things over the last decade plus. And, not to go super deep into the history, but, Burners Without Borders as a program started in 2005. And what happened is the event was just starting up. And all of a sudden, Hurricane Katrina pummeled into the Gulf Coast. And if you think about 2005, it was a different time in the world. Social media was just becoming a thing. We didn't have smartphones yet. And so what happened is that
MySpace.
new, say again?
I think it was still MySpace.
Yeah, it was still MySpace, and so news really organically started to travel around the city. And what happened is that people realized that they might not be going back to the place they had left. Their family members might be in danger, and so people immediately and instinctually wanted to do something. And it was an amazing action of our city and our community coming together. People got satellite phones so people could call home. People started to gather money in the 5-gallon water buckets. People started to gather tools, and what ended up happening is about 40 people left from the event with a truck full of supplies and tools, and they went down to the bayou. And what they found is a local Buddhist temple that had just recently been consecrated, and a lot of the people who had come down were from the temple crew at Burning Man, and so they found this affinity, and they built a resource center and camp in the yard of this temple, and they started doing resource distribution. We got a donation of heavy equipment. We were able to use some of our heavy equipment crews from DPW to start knocking down people's homes so that they could qualify for FEMA trailers. And it was this big aha moment that all of the skills that we've been training and learning through Burning Man and art crews is oftentimes immediately applicable to some of the really hard situations that are elsewhere in the world. And so that was our first aha moment, was that our skills were necessary and needed. And I think the second lesson that is important to tell is that the other thing that we did is, because we were citizens, and we weren't an organization, especially not yet, we were able to take time with the people who had lost things. And so we were able to, if they might have something in their home they wanted to try and get, we could knock down a wall and help them get in, or we might be able to help them just through the emotional process of this instead of just looking at it as an operational task. And so through the experience, we ended up building effigies out of some of the beautiful wood that we would find in our fire pit at night. And what would happen is when we would burn those, communities come around fire, and all of a sudden that kind of hierarchy that happens in a disaster, where you have government employees and then non-for-profit employees and then volunteers and then survivors, has started to become more horizontal, and people started to talk about what was next around that fire. And it was through the experiences like doing the effigy burns or dressing up the camp like a Christmas camp and giving away gifts in December, we came up with this idea of cultural first response as well. Because while we do know that food, water, and shelter are some of the most important things that people need in immediate crisis, the next thing that people need is hope and joy and the opportunity to find optimism in the future. And so that is a place that artists and creatives and just people living from their hearts can really add into that situation, is coming in as a cultural first responder as well.
And so say a little bit more about that, meaning that you'd have musicians or you'd have poets, having people actually contribute art, or is it more about a particular type of conversation that gets initiated around the fire, for example?
Yeah, well, I think it's all of it, and the reason I would never say it is this or that, though there were things there, is that because it really depends on the community that shows up, and it's about learning what the embedded wisdom that is innate in that community that can come forward to respond in those moments. And so there were musicians who were there. There were oftentimes local musicians who would want to tell their story through a song, or it was through clowning with the kids to kind of break up the monotony of what was happening, or again, just the conversations that we could host around that fire, which is a very different approach than it is in a typical relief center, which is very understandable because oftentimes they're trying to offer support to very big populations. And so efficiency and regularity is how you hit a large amount of people. And it is us as citizens where we can come in and kind of add that human touch and that more creative spirit to those situations.
What a beautiful endeavor. And I'm curious, if your whole big part of what you stand for is civic engagement and contributing, right? And actually showing up for your community and being a community-oriented person. When the fires hit Los Angeles, I imagine you had many things going on. You have a big, full life, as do many people. And I know a lot of us grapple with how much is mine to do, right? Like when is it time or mine to be civically engaged versus just continuing to tend my life and my family, my whatever it is that I have going on. I'm just curious how you think about that for yourself and what it is that you encourage people to like, what is your encouragement to the world around civic engagement?
Yeah, well, that is an interesting inflection point, right? And I think that depending on how much personal work we've all done around our boundaries, capabilities, skills, and gifts, that can be a harder decision sometimes to make. I know that for myself, what was obvious in the moment was that what was in front of me was the most important thing, and also that I had a skill set and energy that I could give in surplus in that moment. Um, I think we need to really look at how we take care of ourselves. And I know it's an often repeated thing is that you have to put on your own oxygen mask before you can help others. But in any of these situations, whether it's in a disaster or whether it's even in other struggles that exist in our communities around homelessness or something like that, we really do have to figure out how we're giving from a place of surplus because burnout is a really common thing with people in the social impact space. And so if we want to be able to continue to do this work long term, we need to figure out where our barometers of gifts are and where we're giving beyond that.
Yeah, that's beautiful inquiry. So you live in Topanga. Many of you started, or I was watching what was happening and just really inspired by what was going on in Topanga, which is a place-based community. What do you think was present in the Topanga community that enabled you and many others to start taking care of your neighbors and coordinating and helping each other? Like what was some, because Topanga is a place, so there's communities within Topanga, and then there's by very fact that you live in a place, there's a sense of community. And yet people are not necessarily all connected or have the same values but what do you think was working for that community that enabled the type of firefighting and contribution that was happening that perhaps saved Topanga Canyon?
Yeah. It's interesting because this ties in a lot to part of that story that I was just telling you, where, the genesis of Burns Without Borders was in this active disaster. But when it was done, we came back and we said, how do we continue this beautiful thing that we had created? And Carmen Mock and Tom Price really wanted to, at that moment, focus on this idea of community resiliency. And so, on a long enough timeline, we all know that a disaster will come to our community if we wait long enough. And so, what do we do in the meantime? And for me, it's really around creating communities of practice. That community of practice can be doing all sorts of different things, but it is a way to bring people together in your community in which you get to practice being a volunteer, in which you get to practice organizing, in which you get to learn the asset mapping of who has what in your community, who has what skills in your community. It can be something like cleaning up your highway. It can be taking care of your local beach. It can be volunteering with another center. It can even be throwing, community events. And I think that was something that we had really strongly here in Topanga was a network of people who were interested in sharing their skills, in coming together and creating dinners, in having community organized events. And so when the disaster struck for us, we already had the communication channels. And I think that's one of the big ones is that we had the communication channels of already knowing how to get in touch with each other, even if all of us might not know each other personally. And we had a certain amount of built trust that had come through all of those community experiments we had been doing before. And just one example of that is that one of our Burners Without Borders groups in Corpus Christi, maybe 12, 14 years ago, they decided that they wanted to adopt a couple miles, 7 miles of beach on their key down in Corpus Christi. And so 4 times a year, they would do a camp out on this beach. They would clean it up, they build some art, and they would have this community experience where they felt they were taking stewardship of their local community. And then in 2016, when Hurricane Harvey hit that coast, that was one of the communities that was most ready to respond. And so, there were many lessons in it, but sometimes it can feel simple, like you're just planting some plants or you're cleaning something up with a group of people. But those small skills are where you're really building those muscles that when you need to quickly respond are all of a sudden there and strong and something you can rely on.
Mm. So I'm hearing is fundamentally to encourage everybody to get involved in their local community and activate in some way to contribute, to participate, to volunteer, to create experiences, to be in communication. And not even necessarily, I'm not even hearing you say create friendships with everyone, but create some type of connection so that if something happens, there's at least communication channels already in place. And ideally, you've already done something together. Is that would you encourage people to be doing that in their local neighborhoods?
Absolutely. And I think that is where you start. And to me, the gold star and the
I
stretch
love
goal is,
stars.
huh?
I love gold stars. Tell me, I
Yeah.
want.
Well, if we want the gold star, is to make sure that when we are in a space where we have the privilege of time, that we're also, when we can, reaching out and making connections with those who may not immediately seem like they might be part of our close community. And I think that's become harder and harder in our modern world where we have social media channels that kind of bring us into silos and reinforce the type of people and the type of thought that we might be used to. But I also think that's one of the most key parts of, to me, resilience is having a diversity of voices, a diversity of experiences, a diversity of ages, because there are so many lessons and so many skills that happen across these spectrums. You know, with people who have been on this earth a lot longer, there are a lot more learned skills generally that they have acquired. And on the other end of it, when we have youth, there is a unbridled energy that can come with being in that phase of life. And to me, that is resilience when we can actually pair all of those different skills together. And it means that sometimes we do have to, though, step a little bit outside of our comfort zones. And it does happen kind of naturally in a natural disaster. There's a really wonderful book, if anyone wants to look at it, called A Paradise Built in Hell by Rebecca Solnit, which talks about some of these amazing community cohesions that happen. But we don't have to wait for the disaster. We can do that beforehand, and that'll strengthen our communities, whether or not we have something acute to face in the immediate future.
Hmm. Okay, I know you have some values or principles for building resilient community. You just shared a couple of them, which is actually being connection and build trust and create things together and get to know your neighbors. And I imagine that's part of it. Do you want to expand out in anything that perhaps even that you've learned in stewarding Burners Without Borders and coming to Burning Man year after year? The principles that actually that we can apply when we're thinking about creating community. That's one thing you said to me is that community is something that should be created intentionally, right? There should be some design principles that would make a community resilient. I'd love for you to share those here.
Yeah, well, I'm super inspired by folks, for instance, like Bruce Mao, who have really taken on the call to remind us that we are all designers and the entire world that we are in, it can be designed. And so, how do we design the world that we want to live in? And for me, an important principle of that is also how do we design a world in which flourishing life for all is possible? But in that, one of the things that we realized after, I think probably in 2019, is that we started to realize that some of the design we had around disaster response was no longer keeping up with what was happening anymore. And
Mhm.
so we wrote a collective community essay called The Long Disaster, and you can find it longdisaster.org. And in the long disaster, we posit that, especially back when Katrina happened, we felt like storms like that were maybe once in a decade, or there might be a few in a lifetime. And what that afforded us as people who wanted to be involved and in response was that we could all collectively come together, we could put our effort in, we could help restore that place, and then we could go back home. But what we found is that the world is rapidly changing. Things are stacking up on themselves, and disasters are not only happening all over the world at once, but sometimes multiple disasters are happening in a place at once. And so we had to take a step back and really ask ourselves, as people who are desiring to respond, how do we take care of ourselves? And also, how do we create a new system of thought of how we can approach that? And so in the long disaster, we ended up defining 5 areas that we felt were gaps in our original theory. And so we have the skills gap, which is thinking about how do we define the skills that we need to garner in order to respond to these. The resource gap, as I was kind of talking about, how do we do asset mapping? How do we know what resources are available to us? The communications gap, which I think I was referencing earlier, how do we build resilient communication systems so that we can get a hold of each other and organize? The community gap, which we've already been talking about, how are we building our communities now so that we're ready to respond? And then the last one is the empathy gap, because as all of us are facing more and more in this world, it can be very easy to shut down. It can be very easy to want to bury your head in the sand or in whatever reality escape tunnel we might be able to choose. And it's actually very difficult to look at the world with our eyes wide open and our hearts wide open. It can be overwhelming. Again, we do need to take care of ourselves. It doesn't mean we have to show up that way in every single moment, but these are some of the gaps and kind of the areas that we can work on when we have the privilege of time and a calmer experience of being, so that again, we are ready to respond to whatever is going to come. And for me, the nice thing is that even if that thing doesn't show up in your lifetime when you're there, I think that all of these skills are what it takes to just build that more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible anyways.
What a beautiful message. It has me think about my spiritual teacher that keeps saying that the world as we know it is already over and a new world's being born. There's going to be a lot of crisis, just the time that we're in. And we hopefully have been preparing for these times because they're here. And so all of that preparation that we've done, both on ourselves and in the way that we think about the world, it's time to actually lead. It's time to contribute and it's time to help steward like this is the moment that we're in. And so I applaud you for all the good work you've been doing and this study that you've been in. Because as you were speaking, I was thinking, I hope that if I'm ever in a crisis, you're around. Because there's a steadiness, there's a trustableness because you've been cultivating that skill set. And to wrap up our conversation, is there something that you'd love for people to think about, or if you were to plead to people's hearts, what is my teacher's saying, like, now is the time for us to lead in your work and in your life and the study that you've been in and with what you've just seen in Los Angeles go on. What is it that you want to leave people with? It could be a call to action. It could be an idea. It could be a skill you think everyone should learn. Like, what do you want to invite people into?
Yeah, what a great question. And what I'm hearing in what you're saying as well is something that I'm always reminding myself, even though it feels hard, is that we're the ones we've been waiting for. And so it's up to us to grab the horn and see what we can create. And I think the thing that I would love to impart is that, Burners Without Borders, while we kind of talked about disaster, one of our big tenets is that it's not just about disaster, it's about resilience. It's about building regenerative culture and community. And one of the things I say is that I don't care what you give a damn about. I just want you to give a damn about something. And so my request would be is that anyone who's wondering how to get involved, you don't have to get involved with everything. That is not possible and it's completely overwhelming. It would be to center in on what you feel called to be a part of. There's probably something in your own local community that kind of tickles you in that way where you're like, oh, I wish it could be a little bit different. I wish we could change that. And that's your call to figure out how to get involved in that issue. Because if all of us take the thing that we feel our passion on, then we'll actually have enough energy to tackle everything that's going on in the world. And so it's really around finding that passion that's in you, connecting with that. And there are inevitably other people out there who care about it too. And so build a community around that. And that's where you're going to find that you're building those muscles for resiliency.
I love that call, and I'm going to take a moment to reflect on it because it's been on my mind a lot with so much going on in the world. I want to be aware of what's going on in the world, but then I started asking myself, how educated do I really need to be about these policies and this and this? There's so much going on. And what I decided for myself as a way to be both aware of what's happening in the world and also know when enough is enough or where my attention is not needed is to say, what's actually relevant? Where do I feel deeply moved and would feel called to speak? So we had former mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico on earlier, and she was the mayor during Hurricane Maria. She was the mayor during COVID. She was the mayor during a lot of challenging things. And she was saying a similar thing, which is be willing to be an instigator, meaning be willing to use your voice in these times. Do not be complicit. Actually stand for something. And ideally, in that standing for something, it should bring people together. And so you said that in your own way. And so I'm just echoing that. It feels like a theme that's happened throughout these conversations. And so may we be willing to use our voice to bring people together and to unify and unite people that have otherwise shared differences, but there's always something there's great unifiers, and so thank you for being a voice for that, for being an inspiration and a role model for what it looks like to steward community in an integral and caring way. And you're a beautiful speaker. It was wonderful to receive your wisdom, Christopher. How can people connect with you?
Yeah, you can find, for community work, you can find Burners Without Borders on our website, burnerswithoutborders.org, or on Facebook or on Instagram. And if you want to connect with me, you can always send me an email at breedlove@burningman.org, or you can find me on Instagram at cbreedlove. And just to end too, I wanted to say, because I feel like this is always important, I have the honor of speaking to a story that is not mine, but is the collective work of so many hundreds and thousands of people. So I just wanted to call out, that's why I chose this photo as my background, just to recognize the many, many people who continually step in. And it is that what we were saying, people stepping in one by one when they have that capacity to build something bigger than any of us could do by ourselves.
Mm. And just briefly, is Burner Without Borders more than just the Burning Man camp? Like, if people reach out about community, are you guys coordinating for? Tell us a little bit about Burners Without Borders for people who feel inspired to have something that they can contribute to.
Yeah, quickly, we have 16 chapters and 40 working groups around the world tackling different subject areas and work in their own communities. You can find a map of those on our website. We also have a whole network of project leads and grantees and partner organizations that have oftentimes grown out of projects that we've done over the last 20 years. And so it's a big network. We're, as a program, really here to support you in networking connections, in resource connections, and in helping you tell your story to our larger community. Because when people hear your story, so often they want to jump in and support. And so we're both an amplification megaphone as well as a resource and network to connect you with what you need to get with.
So cool. I love that work. You're so cool. That's a funny way to I don't have anything more profound to say other than you're a really awesome human. And I want you to know that I see you and the good work that you're doing and the good work that all of the Burners Without Borders community has been doing for many years. So thank you for serving. Thank you to Roxy for reconnecting us. And she was the one who said Christopher Breedlove should really be a part of this. And so thank you for bringing this wisdom. And we'll speak soon.
Thanks so much, Charlene.
Okay.